I moved in with my uncle who had a strange set of rules. When I was 12, I was forced to spend a summer with my great-uncle Jeremy. You see, I was a bit of a troublemaker back in those days. My parents thought if I spent some time with my strict grouch of an uncle, I would somehow be rehabilitated. You can imagine how hard my eyes rolled when my mom and dad told me about their plan. But I was oblivious to the horrors I would endure that summer. Uncle Jeremy was somewhat of a mountain man. He lived in the remote wilderness of Montana's high pine forest. A homesteader through and through, he'd made a life where most people would go insane. Granted, Uncle Jeremy did seem a bit kooky to me at the time. My dad almost tossed me out of the car as we rolled into my uncle's mountain cabin. He didn't even wait for Uncle Jeremy to greet me at the door. I watched as Dad's little Prius made its way back down the long driveway and onto the unkempt dirt road. While I was a bit offended by how I'd just been abandoned, I was not envious of the long journey ahead of him. It took us almost 2 hours to traverse that nasty road. I was sure we'd be left stranded at one point or another. A Prius is no off-roading vehicle. The hybrid's tail lights disappeared amongst the dense forest. My attention turned to the rickety wooden cabin. This house was not what you would imagine it to be. It wasn't the picturesque idea people have when they think of a log cabin. I could see the structure had been through a lot. The logs were weathered, faded by the hot Montana summer and the icy winter winds. I could tell that everything used in its construction was sourced from the surrounding forest. Likewise, no modern amenities were visible. No power lines, fire hydrants, or even a satellite dish. I knew then it would be a duller summer than I'd imagined. I lifted a hand to knock on the old door, and stopped when I noticed a few deep scratch marks on its facade. Bears? I thought to myself. An uneasy feeling that I was being watched from the pines came over me. I cocked my head in the direction of the tree line. It felt like something was calling me over to the woods. The door squealed open, and I returned my gaze to the cabin. In the passageway stood a grey-bearded man, the fibres in his beard long, greasy, and matted. His skin was old and weathered. I suspected the same reasoning as the cabin's. He looked at me through the grey film in his eyes. I'd never actually met Uncle Jeremy up until that point, but I'd heard stories about him from my father. My father had suffered the same fate as me the summer between 7th and 8th grade. He told me Uncle Jeremy was not a man to be trifled with. You listen to everything your Uncle Jeremy tells you. He is not a man you want to make angry. My father would lecture, but when I looked into the face of the withering man, I didn't sense an ounce of animosity. He almost seemed kind. Nothing resembled the ferocity my father had mentioned. "Hi, I'm Marcus." I outstretched my hand in the introduction, but he slapped it away before placing a hand over my mouth. "Shh, we don't say names here." He moved my head over to the side to make sure no one or nothing was listening. More of my father's description of my great-uncle came to mind. "Uncle Jeremy is a bit strange, but he has your best interest in mind. Try your best to ignore his lack of civility." His words were all starting to make sense now. Uncle Jeremy ushered me into the cabin, and I thought I heard him whisper my name as he pushed me inside. That is, until I turned to see the look of fear in his eyes. I knew then that the sound had drifted in on the early summer breeze, somewhere beyond the tree line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood. "Is everything okay, Uncle Jeremy?" His open palm slapped my cheek as I spoke his name. "Damn it, kid, I told you no names," he said through gritted teeth before returning his gaze to the tree line. Almost like a dream, a faint voice slithered into the cabin. "Jeremy," the voice called. "What the hell is that?" I asked, but received no reply. Uncle Jeremy quickly slammed the door shut. "Rule number 1, no names." I dropped my gaze at his reprimand. "Rule number 2, if you hear something strange, leave it be. Ignore it, you hear me?" I ponder his instructions before moving to question his logic. WY. Not another word on the matter. Those are the rules. My only rules. You follow them, or I'll send you back to your little life in Boise, you hear me? Just then my escape from homestead living became clear. Break a few rules here and there, and I'd be back in the gem state. I tried not to smile at the plot that was formulating in my mind. Your room is down yonder." The old man pointed down a small hallway before leading me to it himself. We stepped into a small 10 by 10 room. I threw my backpack onto the bed and plopped down right beside it, giving a grunt of relief. "What do you think you're doing, kid? This isn't some luxurious mountain retreat." I eyed the crumbling wooden walls. The understatement of the century, I thought to myself. "We have work to do." He moved to the window and pushed open the shutters, taking in a lung full of pristine mountain air in the process. Beyond his gaze stood a 2-acre clearing in the forest. A mix of fields more comparable to glorified gardens and livestock, chickens, goats, and 1 cow. He turned to me and noted my disappointed face. "What, you think this was a free ride?" "No, we work for our food," he said, with the first ounce of enjoyment I'd seen inch across his face. He pulled open a drawer on the nightstand. "I placed these here for you before you got here." I peered into the drawer to find some old torn overalls. "You put those on and meet me outside. There's a lot to get done around here. The faster we get it over with, the faster we can have ourselves a nice supper." Later that night I lay in bed unable to sleep. All of my muscles were aching. Uncle Jeremy was not lying. Homestead living is not for the weak. We'd worked until the sun met the horizon, and this time of year in Montana, that was around 9:30 p.m. We'd weeded the fields, fed the chickens, and milked the dairy cow, whose name I found out to be Bessie, and done dozens upon dozens of other tasks that were not very enjoyable. The best thing about it was that Uncle Jeremy said we would do it all again the next day. I placed the pillow over my face, hoping that it would suffocate me. I was a beat dog that needed to be put out of its misery. The warmth of the plush fabric seemed to comfort me a bit, so I left it there as the night slowly to wash over me. Just as I was about to fall into an uneasy night of sleep, I heard scratching from the other side of the wall. It was coming from outside. The sound was very faint. It almost reminded me of the time we had mice inside the walls back home. Only these walls were not hollow. They were solid lumber. I moved the pillow off to the side, making sure that nothing muted to the scraping by my head. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The noise sounded rhythmic, as if someone was sending a message. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Whatever it was clawing deeper into the side of the cabin. The noisemaker was making the noise was too strong to be a mouse. A raccoon, maybe. Then the sound intensified to a loud, ear-piercing screech, like someone clawing at an old chalkboard. Screech, screech, screech. I shot to a seated position. It must have been a bear. Montana grizzlies scared the shit out of me, part of the reason why I'd never come to meet Uncle Jeremy in the first place. I heard the same faint whisper that had come from the tree line earlier that day, only this time instead of Uncle Jeremy's name. My name hissed through the cracks of the cabin. Marcus. I looked at the shutters on the window, and my heart dropped when I saw something slowly pulling them open. "Uncle Jeremy," I shouted. From down the hall I heard a bedroom door smash open, followed by my room's door. Uncle Jeremy stood there holding his .22 in hand, his eyes meeting mine, before noticing the slowly creeping shutters. He leaned the gun on the wooden wall before running over to the shutters and forcing them closed. He quickly locked the latch before turning to me. "Kid, I had 2 rules and you broke both of them the first night." He shouted at me while I made sense of what just happened. I was hoping that the more my uncle talked, the more the situation would clear up. But everything he said just made me more confused and, frankly, terrified. "Now you've done it, kid. It now knows our names. It's imprinted on us. You have no idea how hard it was to get rid of the last one." The last one, I thought. "Well, what are you talking about?" I quivered. "Never mind that. From now on you keep these shutters locked here." He didn't have to tell me twice. The whole house is going to be locked down. And just so we're clear, if you hear me calling your name, it ain't me. What the hell? What else could it be? I thought before I opened my mouth to ask a clarifying question. "What is it?" I said. "What's my second rule?" my uncle commanded. I pondered for a bit before responding. "If I see something, leave it be." "That's right, leave it be. No more of this. We will not talk about it any more. It will only encourage it. Suddenly, I no longer wanted to go through with my plot to get Uncle Jeremy to send me home. The next morning after breakfast, Uncle Jeremy and I stepped outside to inspect the side of the wall where the noise was coming from. Uncle Jeremy touted a gun belt today, a magnum revolver in its sheath. When we gazed at the marks on the wall, I was sure that no grizzly had created the noise. These scratches were not random like the ones on the door. No, these markings were indeed a message. Drawn on the wooden logs was a cryptic symbol, a circle with 3 jagged lines drawn through it. On top of this circle were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. I gulped as Uncle Jeremy got a closer look. He gave a nervous chuckle. "He'll be back tonight," he said, in a tone that desiring itself to be false. My stomach fluttered in fear. Bessie the dairy cow gave an agonizing moo. I could tell that something was bothering her. Uncle Jeremy turned with a sad look on his face. He took to his feet and walked his way over to the cow. When he was feet away from her, he took to one knee. "It's already begun." I looked over his shoulder, and my mouth dropped when I saw the sight of gore that still torments me to this day. Bessie's udders were mutilated, flesh hanging off of each of the protrusions, and flies feasting on her fresh wounds as blood mixed with milk. "Poor Bessie," Uncle Jeremy said. I could tell that seeing his cow suffer made him emotional. I moved to comfort him, but before my hand could grace his shoulder, he stood. He unholstered the magnum and pointed it at Bessie's head. One shot rang out as every bird in the vicinity took flight. Bessie was dead. She now lay in a pool of blood and brain matter. Uncle Jeremy wiped away some tears, before turning around and walking briskly back to the cabin. "Come on, kid, we have to get ready." I knew that we were heading for some kind of battle. When the night fell on the cabin that day, Uncle Jeremy and I did not talk. We had barricaded ourselves and all of the livestock inside the little cabin, a total of 22 chickens, 7 goats, and a variety of domesticated geese. He'd thrust a rifle in my hand and give me instructions on how to shoot, though he said not to use it unless something happened to him. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had roosted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side. It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy, oh Uncle Jeremy," it sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice as bait. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out of the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. Oh shit. Suddenly a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the comforts of the cabin. I heard screams, but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet, and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid, I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. but as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part, skin sticking to its upper and lower jaws like large wads of gum, until they eventually gave way to sharp teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a green pool of blood. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. After that night, I had no problems following any of Uncle Jeremy's rules, no matter how arbitrary they were. We worked his homestead all summer, and I never mentioned his name again. I was never one for the rules, but in this instance, I was not going to summon another creature. Although I would see things dart beyond the tree line, I never mentioned them. At the end of the summer, I was adamant that I would never spend another day with my Uncle Jeremy, a model citizen through and through. 10 years later, I received word that my great-uncle Jeremy had passed. At first I suspected old age, he was ancient after all, but my father informed me that it had been a bear attack that ended his life. He was a hard son of a bitch, and a hard son of a bitch deserved to go out like a man, I thought to myself. But then I started to question if a bear was really the culprit. My thoughts turned to the creature that once called from the other side of the cabin walls. I thought of its blank face and its jagged claws. The day before I was set to leave for his funeral, I received a letter in the mail. The address it was sent from was Uncle Jeremy's P.O. box. I'd assumed he'd left something in his will for me, but as I unsealed the letter, I found a single piece of paper. Written in blood was the same circle Uncle Jeremy and I had found carved on the other side of the cabin walls, the lines drawn across it just as jagged. I looked to the top of the circle, the same 2 names were written out. Only this time one was crossed out, Uncle Jeremy's. At that second I heard faint scratching from the other side of my house in Idaho. I don't know how, but one of them found me.